A heartless millionaire, notorious for his lack of empathy, compels his black Maid to sing at a high society event, hoping to make her a laughingstock. Instead, her soulful performance moves the audience to tears, leading to an unexpected change in their perception of her and him. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Richard Stokes' penthouse in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park, its autumn colors muted by the approaching dusk. The space buzzed with activity as caterers and event staff moved efficiently through the 5,000-square-foot apartment, preparing for tonight's charity gala. Richard stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his custom-made Tom Ford tuxedo. At 52, he cut an imposing figure, tall, lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and hard gray eyes that reflected years of calculated business decisions. His movements were precise, practiced, the result of countless high-society events where appearance meant everything. "Stevens," he called out to his butler, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. "Has everyone arrived for the pre-event briefing?" "Yes, sir." The staff is assembled in the service area, including the new housekeeper, Clara. Richard's lip curled slightly at the mention of Clara. She'd been hired 2 weeks ago, and something about her quiet dignity irritated him. Perhaps it was the way she maintained eye contact a fraction too long, or how she carried herself with an understated confidence that seemed inappropriate for her position. In the kitchen, the staff stood in a neat line, waiters in crisp black uniforms, bartenders reviewing wine lists, and Clara, wearing a simple black dress that marked her as household staff. Richard entered, immediately commanding attention. The air grew tenser with each click of his Italian leather shoes against the marble floor. Tonight's guest list includes the CEO of Goldman Sachs, 3 state senators, and the publisher of the New York Times, Richard announced, pacing before them. "I expect perfection. One mistake," his eyes lingered on Clara, "and you'll be looking for new employment before midnight." The staff nodded, their faces carefully neutral. Only Clara maintained that steady gaze that made Richard's jaw tighten. He approached her, standing close enough to make most people step back. She didn't move. "You'll be managing the coat check," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Think you can handle that without losing any six-figure furs?" "Yes, Mr. Stokes," Clara replied, her voice steady. "I managed coat check operations at the Metropolitan Opera House for 3 years. Richard's eyes narrowed at her response. It wasn't insubordinate, but it hinted at competence beyond what he'd assumed. The other staff members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the brewing tension. As guests began arriving, Richard transformed. His smile became practiced charm, his laugh carefully modulated to convey just the right amount of warmth. He guided conversations with the skill of a conductor, highlighting his recent acquisition of a struggling tech company and his plans to streamline its operations, a euphemism for the mass layoffs he had planned. The penthouse filled with New York's elite, their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers, their conversations a carefully orchestrated dance of power and influence. Richard moved among them like a shark through shallow waters, always aware of who might be useful and who could be discarded. He noticed Clara efficiently managing the coat check, her movements graceful and professional. Something about her composure continued to needle him. When he overheard a guest compliment her handling of a complicated coat mix-up, an idea formed, one that would remind everyone of their proper PLA. See in his world. The night progressed, fueled by expensive champagne and even more expensive promises. Richard waited for the perfect moment, when the crowd was warm with alcohol and the artificial camaraderie of wealth. He caught Clara's eye and beckoned her over, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes. The room quieted as he raised his hand, commanding attention with the ease of someone accustomed to power. The stage was set for his calculated humiliation, though none of the guests yet realized what was about to unfold. Clara stood in the center of Richard's expansive living room, surrounded by New York's elite. The silence felt heavy, expectant. Among the sea of unfamiliar faces, she caught sight of Lisa Martinez, her best friend who worked as a paralegal for one of the law firms represented at the gala. Lisa's presence was unexpected, a friendly face in hostile territory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of public speaking. "My housekeeper here tells me she used to work at the Metropolitan Opera House." He paused for effect, swirling the champagne in his crystal flute. "Surely someone with such prestigious experience wouldn't mind favoring us with a song?" Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the deliberate cruelty in Richard's suggestion. Others leaned forward, eager for the entertainment of watching someone squirm. Clara's hands, normally steady, trembled slightly at her sides. The room seemed to shrink, the expensive artwork on the walls blurring at the edges of her vision. She felt the weight of countless similar moments, times when people in power had tried to diminish her, expecting her to break. Lisa caught her eye from across the room. They'd met 5 years ago at a community center in Harlem, where they both volunteered teaching literacy classes. Lisa gave an almost imperceptible nod, her expression fierce with support. In that moment, Clara remembered their late-night conversations about dignity, about refusing to let others define your worth. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Richard's smile began to falter, just slightly, as Clara remained quiet. He hadn't expected this composed resistance. "Well," he prompted, an edge creeping into his voice. "We're waiting." Clara took a deep breath, her spine straightening. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned houses in Georgia but never let anyone make her feel small. She thought of the choir at her church, where she'd learned that music could be both a shield and a weapon. When she opened her mouth to sing, she chose Amazing Grace, not the gentle version sung in quiet churches, but the raw, powerful rendition that spoke of survival and triumph. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the penthouse without any accompaniment. The first note caught the audience off guard. Several guests who had been smirking now froze, wine glasses halfway to their lips. Richard's self-satisfied expression flickered, replaced momentarily by uncertainty. Clara's voice carried years of history, the weight of struggle, the power of perseverance, the unstoppable force of dignity. She didn't look at Richard as she sang. Instead, she looked at each guest, one by one, forcing them to see her as a complete human being. The song grew in power, each verse building on the last. A woman in an expensive red dress pressed her hand to her throat, eyes glistening. An older man with a military bearing stood straighter, recognition of something profound crossing his features. Lisa watched her friend with fierce pride, remembering the nights they'd spent discussing their dreams, their fears, their determination to succeed in a world that often seemed designed to exclude them. She saw the same strength now that had drawn them together as friends. The room's atmosphere transformed. The earlier artificiality of social pleasantries gave way to something authentic and uncomfortable. Guests who had been carefully maintaining their social masks found themselves transported to memories of their own struggles, their own moments of grace. Richard stood absolutely still, his champagne forgotten in his hand. He watched as his carefully orchestrated evening of social manipulation was transformed into something entirely different. The power dynamics he'd taken for granted shifted beneath his feet like sand. Clara's voice soared through the final verse, filling every corner of the penthouse with undeniable truth. She wasn't performing for their entertainment. She was testifying to her own worth, her own humanity. The last note hung in the air, powerful and defiant. In the silence that followed, no one moved. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, but inside, time seemed suspended. Clara stood tall, her dignity intact, even enhanced. She had taken Richard's attempt at humiliation and turned it into a moment of transformation. The first person to break the silence was an elderly woman in the back, who began to applaud with tears streaming down her face. Others joined in, the sound building until it filled the room with the same intensity as Clara's voice had moments before. Richard remained frozen, his calculated world of social hierarchy and power plays crumbling around him. He watched as his guests responded not to wealth or status, but to raw human truth. For the first time in years, He felt something crack in his carefully constructed facade. Lisa struggled to maintain her professional composure as the applause continued. Her hands shook slightly as she dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. 20 years of friendship with Clara flashed through her mind. Late nights studying for their GEDs, sharing meals when money was tight, celebrating small victories in a world that rarely acknowledged them. From her position near the back of the room, she watched the crowd's reaction. These were people she usually only saw from behind mahogany desks or across polished conference tables. Now, their carefully maintained veneers had cracked, revealing glimpses of genuine emotion. Clara's voice had done more than fill the room. It had excavated memories many of these people had buried beneath years of privilege and pretense. The song choice wasn't accidental. Amazing Grace carried centuries of history, of struggle and redemption, of pain and triumph. An older black woman in an expensive suit caught Lisa's eye and nodded slowly, a gesture of shared understanding. Both women recognized the weight of this moment. In their professional lives, they'd learned to navigate spaces where their presence was often questioned, their competence constantly tested. The song's echoes seemed to linger in the air, mixing with the memories it had stirred. A senior partner from Lisa's firm stood near the window, his usual sharp expression softened by something that looked like recognition. His daughter, Lisa knew, had recently completed rehab. Perhaps Clara's voice had touched that private pain, that hope for grace and second chances. Throughout the room, conversations began in hushed tones, different from the earlier artificial chatter. A judge spoke quietly about her grandmother, who had cleaned houses while putting herself through night school. A CEO mentioned his immigrant parents and the songs they used to sing to keep their spirits up during difficult times. Clara remained standing where she had performed, her presence commanding respect rather than seeking it. She'd transformed from invisible staff member to the evening's emotional center, though Lisa knew her friend would handle this shift with characteristic grace. Richard Stokes stood apart from the crowd, his usual confidence visibly shaken. Lisa observed him with professional interest. She'd seen his type before, men whose power had become their prison. Something in Clara's performance. He had struck a chord he hadn't expected to hear. The song had forced everyone present to confront the artificial barriers they constructed. Class, race, privilege. Clara's voice had cut through these divisions, revealing the shared humanity beneath. Lisa watched as guests who had earlier barely acknowledged the serving staff now engaged them in genuine conversation. A young analyst from Goldman Sachs approached Clara, tears still visible on her cheeks. She spoke about her own grandmother, a domestic worker who had saved every penny to send her children to college. Clara listened with the same dignity she brought to everything, offering quiet understanding rather than judgment. The atmosphere in the penthouse had fundamentally shifted. The expensive artwork on the walls, the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble floors. All these symbols of wealth and status seemed somehow diminished in importance. Clara's voice had reminded everyone present of more fundamental truths. Lisa made her way slowly through the crowd toward her friend. She noticed how people stepped aside respectfully, how their gazes now held recognition rather than dismissal. This, she knew, was what real change looked like. Not grand gestures, but small shifts in perception that could, over time, transform entire worlds. Richard remained isolated, watching the scene unfold. His earlier attempt at humiliation had backfired spectacularly, forcing him to confront something in himself. Lisa recognized the look of a man seeing his own reflection clearly for the first time in years. The evening's carefully planned schedule had dissolved. No one seemed interested in returning to the artificial pleasantries that usually characterize such events. Instead, small groups formed throughout the penthouse, engaging in conversations that felt real, necessary, overdue. Clara caught Lisa's eye and smiled slightly. Not the professional smile she wore at work, but the real one, the one that spoke of shared history and understanding. In that moment, both women recognized that something significant had shifted, though neither could yet predict where these changes would lead. The standing ovation thundered through Richard's penthouse, but he barely heard it. A strange pressure had built in his throat, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He found himself backing away from the crowd, seeking refuge in his private study, a wood-paneled room that usually represented power, but now felt like a hiding place. He loosened his bow tie, the silk suddenly feeling like a noose. The room's temperature seemed to have dropped, though the thermostat remained unchanged. Through the study's heavy door, he could still hear the murmur of conversation, drastically different from the artificial social chatter he was accustomed to hosting. Richard's hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of scotch. Not the bottle he served guests, but his private reserve, a 50-year-old Macallan that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The liquor burned, but failed to dissolve the knot in his throat. His reflection in the study's window caught his attention. Behind the expensive suit and carefully maintained appearance, he saw something else, a ghost of someone he'd almost forgotten. Jimmy Stokes, the kid from Queens who used to help his mother clean offices after school. The memory hit him with unexpected force. He remembered the smell of industrial cleaning fluid, the ache in his knees from scrubbing floors, the sound of his mother's humming as she worked, the same Clara had just sung. His mother had loved that song, used to sing it while preparing dinner in their tiny kitchen, her hands raw from cleaning chemicals. Richard sank into his leather chair, the one that had cost more than his father had made in a year driving a delivery truck. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades building walls of wealth and privilege, only to have them cracked by the same song that had once been his mother's comfort. He remembered the day he decided to reinvent himself. Fresh out of community college, he'd lied about his background on a job application, claimed a degree from a better school. That first lie had led to others, each one taking him further from Jimmy Stokes and closer to Richard Stokes, the business titan. Through the window, the city lights blurred. He reached for his pocket square, Italian silk, obscenely expensive, and pressed it against his eyes. When was the last time he cried? The day of his mother's funeral, perhaps, though he'd made sure no one saw those tears. The sounds from the main room had changed. Instead of the usual superficial laughter and networking, he heard genuine conversations, stories being shared, truths being spoken. His carefully orchestrated evening of social manipulation had transformed into something real, something he no longer controlled. He thought of Clara's face as she sang, dignified, strong, unbroken. She'd reminded him of his mother in that moment, though he'd tried to deny the recognition. Both women carried themselves with a grace that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The scotch in his glass caught the light, amber reflecting like tears. He remembered his father's words at their last meeting, before Richard had cut ties with his family. "Money's made you mean, Jimmy. Your mother would be ashamed." He dismissed those words then, buried them under achievements and acquisitions. Now, with Clara's voice still echoing in his mind, those words resurfaced. He'd spent years building his empire, crushing competitors, manipulating markets, treating people like resources to be exploited. When had he become the kind of person who would try to humiliate someone for entertainment? A knock at the study door startled him. "Mr. Stokes?" It was Stevens, his butler. "Your guests are asking for you." Richard stood, straightening his jacket automatically. His hands still trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. Gold links that could pay a month's rent for most families. The man in the window's reflection looked different now, uncomfortable in his own skin. The knot in his throat hadn't dissolved. If anything, it had grown tighter. He realized it wasn't just emotion he was feeling. It was shame. Deep, genuine shame. The kind he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, to rebuild his usual facade of control. But something had shifted. Clara's voice had reached past his defenses, touching the part of him he'd tried so hard to bury. The part that remembered what it felt like to be on the other side of privilege. The penthouse buzzed with a new kind of energy as Clara found herself surrounded by guests who now looked at her with different eyes. The same people who had barely acknowledged her presence an hour ago now sought her attention, their practiced social masks replaced by genuine interest and, in some cases, shame. A prominent art gallery owner touched Clara's arm gently. "My mother," she began, then stopped to compose herself. "My mother cleaned houses in Connecticut. She used to sing that same hymn." The woman's expensive makeup couldn't hide her emotion. I've spent years pretending that wasn't part of my story." Clara accepted these confessions with quiet dignity, neither absolving nor condemning. Her performance had cracked something in the room's carefully maintained social structure, allowing buried truths to surface. She noticed how the other household staff now moved through the crowd with straighter backs, meeting guests' eyes with newfound confidence. Richard's absence was conspicuous. He had retreated to his study shortly after her performance, leaving an unusual power vacuum in the room. The typical social hierarchy of these events had dissolved, replaced by something more authentic and unpredictable. A small group had formed near the grand piano, where a hedge fund manager was speaking. Quietly about his grandfather, who had worked as a janitor at Harvard.